The file on humanity was underwhelming. Assessor Kale had reviewed hundreds of emerging civilizations over the course of his career, some chaotic, some brilliant, some so unstable they barely survived their first contact with the wider galaxy. Compared to those, humanity looked simple, predictable. 6,000 years of recorded civilization. Fragmented progress. Repeated internal conflict. A species that had nearly eliminated itself more than once before it had even learned how to leave its own atmosphere. He skimmed the summary again, not because it required attention, but because it didn't. No unusual biological traits. No exceptional technological leaps. No evidence of early unification. Just another young species, loud, divided, and still figuring itself out. He set the file aside. Outside his office window, the capital of Orinth Prime stretched endlessly, structures that had stood longer than humanity had known what permanence meant. Entire districts older than their written history. Civilizations layered upon civilizations, each one refining what came before it. This was what maturity looked like. Humanity, by comparison, was a footnote. Temporary. Replaceable. Unremarkable. Kale had seen their type before. Species that arrived with confidence they hadn't earned yet. Species that believed surviving their own planet made them ready for the galaxy. They all followed the same pattern. Initial curiosity, slow integration, eventual correction. Nothing surprising. Nothing new. He tapped the side of his desk and pulled up the delegation profile. For representatives. Standard diplomatic composition. Formal attire carefully selected to appear unified. Posture controlled. Expressions neutral in the way that suggested training rather than instinct. His eyes paused briefly on the one standing at the center. Ambassador Lyra Voss. Age 52. Her expression was difficult to categorize. Not nervous. Not impressed. Not defiant. Just still. As if the moment required nothing from her. Kale frowned slightly, more out of habit than concern, then dismissed the thought just as quickly. There was nothing unusual about composure. Many species trained their representatives to appear steady during first contact procedures. He made a small note anyway. Delegation leader, controlled demeanor. Then he closed the file. It would be a routine assignment. A standard evaluation. 6 months, perhaps a year at most. After that, he would move on to something more interesting. Humanity, he decided, would not take long. The assembly hall of Orinth Prime was designed to impress. Not in the crude way of scale alone, though it had that in abundance, but in the quiet, deliberate way of accumulated time. Every surface, every structure, every proportion in the chamber reflected a civilization that had stopped trying to prove its greatness and simply existed within it. Kale had always appreciated that. The floor stretched wide and dark beneath the high, unseen ceiling, polished to a mirror-like stillness that caught and held light without reflecting it sharply. The air carried the low hum of translation fields, layered frequencies of dozens of species existing in shared communication without friction. 73 civilizations held membership in the Orinth Assembly. 73. Each one older than humanity. Each one having passed through the same stages. Fragmentation, expansion, stabilization, and finally, integration into something larger than themselves. It was not a difficult process. It only required time. And humanity, by every measurable standard, had not had enough of it. Kale took his place along the observer tier, a position reserved for those who studied rather than decided. From there, the entire chamber opened before him, the inner ring where voting members sat, the secondary tier for advisory delegates, and beyond that, the outer ring, where new species waited, where humanity would sit. He had seen dozens of first entries. The pattern rarely changed. New species entered the hall with visible restraint, some attempting to mask awe, others failing entirely. They looked upward, outward, trying to absorb the scale of what they had just joined. It was natural. It was expected. The assembly was, after all, the largest cooperative structure in known space. It had a weight to it, a presence, and most species felt it immediately. The chamber doors opened. The human delegation entered. 4 figures, aligned in a clean formation, moving at a steady, unhurried pace across the polished floor. Kale watched them the way a scientist watches a familiar experiment, already confident in the outcome. Their steps echoed, small sounds in a very large space. No hesitation. No visible adjustment. No upward glances. They did not look at the ceiling. They did not look at the gathered representatives. They did not look at anything at all except the path ahead of them. Kale's eyes narrowed slightly. Not confusion. Just a pause. Most species at this point reacted. Even the most disciplined among them showed something: curiosity, tension, the subtle shift of posture that came from standing inside something far older than themselves. The humans showed nothing. They walked as if the room had no effect on them. As if scale meant nothing. As if they had seen it before. The thought surfaced briefly, and was dismissed just as quickly. That wasn't possible. He adjusted his posture and continued observing. At the front of the chamber, Chancellor Viral rose from the central podium. At nearly 1,000 years old, Viral was not only the longest-serving official in the Assembly, but also one of its most stabilizing presences. His voice, when he spoke, carried the effortless authority of something that had never needed to prove itself. Today, he began, we welcome a new participant into the shared structure of the Assembly. The translation fields adjusted seamlessly, carrying his words across 73 biological frameworks without distortion. The species known as humanity has demonstrated sufficient development and stability to warrant observer status. A subtle reaction moved through the chamber. Not laughter. Nothing so direct. But something close. A soft shift in posture among the older species. A quiet acknowledgement passed between representatives, familiar, almost routine. Another young civilization. Another beginning. Kale had seen this reaction many times before. It was not cruel. It was accurate. Observer status was not a recognition of importance. It was an invitation to learn, to watch, to grow into something that might, eventually, matter. Chancellor Viral extended the ceremonial medallion. Ambassador Lyra Voss, he said, you stand here as the representative of your people. You are granted access to this assembly in the capacity of observer. You will listen, you will study, and in time, you will understand. The words were formal, ancient, unchanged across thousands of years. The structure of them carried a quiet implication. You are not ready yet. Ambassador Voss stepped forward. She accepted the medallion. Her movements were precise, efficient, unaffected. No visible reaction to the room. No adjustment to the tone of the moment. No indication that anything about this experience was overwhelming or even particularly notable. Kale felt that pause again. Slightly longer this time. She spoke the required acceptance phrase, short, neutral, identical to what every new species had said before. Then she stepped back. The delegation moved to the outer ring. Their assigned position, smaller seating, partially obstructed view, physically removed from the center of decision-making. The place reserved for those who were still becoming. Ambassador Voss sat down, folded her hands, and looked forward. Not studying, not observing, just waiting. Kale made another note. Delegation exhibits minimal environmental response. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before adding, unusual. Then he closed the entry. Low priority. There was nothing in the data to suggest this was anything more than behavioral variance. Some species reacted strongly. Others did not. It meant nothing. It always meant nothing. And yet, he found himself watching them longer than he intended. Kale's official assignment arrived the following morning. Standard classification. Standard timeline. Standard expectations. Cultural liaison, Humanities Study Program, Cycle 1. He accepted it without hesitation. It was routine work. Cataloging, observation, comparative analysis. He had completed 32 such studies over the course of his career, each one following the same general trajectory. Initial contact. Cultural mapping. Behavioral prediction. Final integration assessment. Predictable. Contained. Temporary. He opened a new file and began filling in the standard fields. planetary geology, population genetics, mythological frameworks, technological progression timeline. His hands moved faster than his attention. He had done this enough times that the structure of the work no longer required active thought. Humanity would follow the same pattern as the others. They always did. He scheduled his first formal meeting with Ambassador Voss for later that afternoon. The meeting room assigned to the human delegation was modest by assembly standards. Functional, quiet, efficient. The kind of space designed for information exchange, not ceremony. Kale arrived precisely on time. She was already there. Seated. Still, not reviewing documents. Not interacting with the room's interface systems. Not preparing in any of the ways most representatives did before a formal briefing. Just sitting. Hands resting lightly on the table. Eyes unfocused, not distracted, but not fixed on anything either. Kale took his seat across from her and offered the standard greeting. Ambassador Voss. I am Assessor Kale. I will be coordinating your orientation and study process for the duration of your observer period. I know, she said. Her voice was calm. Not dismissive. Not warm. Just certain. Kale paused briefly. Most delegates did not read the profiles of their assigned liaisons in detail. There was no reason to. He moved past it. I've prepared an orientation package, he continued, sliding the data interface across the table. Assembly structure, procedural expectations, developmental benchmarks, everything required for. You should start with your geological scan. He stopped. Excuse me? Your planetary survey data, she said, as if clarifying something obvious. The deep scan of the Anatolian region. Below the primary sediment layer. Kale blinked once. That would be part of the standard geological review, he said carefully. It's already scheduled. Not the standard scan. She tapped the edge of the data interface once, not activating it, just indicating. The deep layer. Past the expected boundary. There was no emphasis in her voice. No insistence. Just direction. Kale studied her for a moment. Why? He asked. A simple question. A reasonable one. She met his gaze. Because it will help you, she said, understand the rest. And then, nothing. No elaboration. No explanation. She picked up the orientation file he had provided and began reading it as if the conversation had already concluded. Kale remained still for a moment longer. Waiting. Expecting clarification. It didn't come. He glanced down at his data pad and made a note. Recommendation. Review geological scan, Anatolian deep strata. He paused. Then added. Reason. Will help understand cultural data. He hesitated again. Then wrote, beneath it. Unclear. A small symbol appeared next to the entry, a star. His personal notation system. Return to this later. He had dozens of such entries across his previous studies. Minor irregularities. Unresolved curiosities. Things that did not fit cleanly into the larger pattern, but rarely mattered in the final analysis. He closed the note. Understood, he said, returning to the structured format of the meeting. We'll proceed with the standard orientation sequence. She nodded once. The rest of the session unfolded exactly as expected. 12 standard questions. 12 direct answers. No resistance. No deviation. Efficient. Predictable. Normal. At the end of the meeting, she stood. Extended her hand. A human gesture he had read about but rarely encountered in practice. He mirrored it. Controlled. I expect we'll work well together, she said. There was something about the way she said it that made it sound less like expectation and more like certainty. Then she left. Kale remained in the room for several seconds after the door closed. The silence felt heavier than it should have. He looked down at his datapad. At the starred note. Geological scan. Anatolian deep strata. He almost dismissed it. Almost. There were dozens of higher priority tasks already queued. Initial behavioral mapping alone would take days. The geological review could wait. It always could. He locked the file. And moved on to the next item in his schedule. He did not check the scan that day. The The first session humanity attended as observers was procedural, routine, a mid-tier resource allocation agreement between two established member civilizations. The kind of matter that required precision but not attention. Most senior delegates had sent junior representatives. There was nothing here worth studying. Kale knew this, which is why he noticed it immediately. Ambassador Voss was watching everything. Not casually, not politely, completely. Her attention did not drift. She did not consult any interface. She did not speak to her delegation. She did not engage in the subtle background behaviors that most observers adopted when nothing of significance was happening. She watched every exchange, every vote, every pause between speakers. As if it mattered, Kale found himself watching her instead of the proceedings. After several minutes, he made a note. Delegation leader maintains full attention during low-priority session. He added, beneath it, possible overcompensation for observer status. He paused, then added, standard behavior. He underlined it. Then, after a moment, removed the underline. After the session concluded, Chancellor Viral passed through the outer ring. A gesture of courtesy. He stopped briefly at the human delegation. Ambassador Voss, he said, I trust you are finding the assembly instructive. Yes, she replied. Nothing more. No elaboration. No attempt to impress. Viral smiled slightly. In time, it becomes intuitive, he said. The structure reveals itself. I'm sure it does, she said. Kale watched the exchange carefully. There was something in it he couldn't quite place. Not tension. Not respect. Something misaligned. As if they were participating in the same conversation, but not from the same context. 3 days later, Kale reviewed the initial cultural reports. Standard findings. Humanity exhibited expected traits. High adaptability. Moderate cooperative structures. Competitive internal systems. Fragmented historical narratives. Nothing unusual. Nothing that deviated from the baseline model of emerging civilizations. He approved the preliminary assessments without hesitation. Then opened the geological file. He had not intended to. It had been next in sequence. Routine. Just another section to confirm and archive. He accessed the planetary survey database. Located Earth. Navigated to regional scans. Anatolian Shelf. The standard scan appeared first. Everything was normal. Sediment layers. Climate signatures. Tectonic history. The expected patterns of a geologically active but stable world. He almost closed it, then paused, scrolled deeper, adjusted the scan parameters, past the standard analysis range, into the deeper strata. The first anomaly appeared at 74,000 years. A thick layer of ash. Uniform. Planet-wide distribution. Kale recognized it immediately. Toba event, he said quietly to himself. A known supervolcanic eruption. A near-extinction event in early human history. Documented. Expected. He moved past it. The second layer stopped him. It sat below the first. Older. Approximately 190,000 years. He zoomed in. The composition was similar, but not identical. Too uniform. Too evenly distributed. Volcanic ash dispersed from a central point. This layer did not. It appeared simultaneous. As if it had originated everywhere at once. Kale frowned. Ran the scan again. Same result. He scrolled deeper. The third layer. 430,000 years. Same structure. Same uniformity. A fourth. A fifth. A sixth. Each one spaced across time. Each one separated by hundreds of thousands of years. Each one identical in pattern. Not random. Not natural. Structured. Kale leaned back in his chair. His eyes moved across the data slowly. Measuring intervals. Comparing distributions. Running silent calculations he had performed thousands of times before. The spacing between the layers was not equal. But it was consistent. The gaps were decreasing. Gradually. Systematically. As if something. He stopped the thought. Pulled up the data again. Reran the analysis. No errors. No corruption. The pattern held. He opened a new note. Multiple ash layers detected below standard geological boundary. He paused, then added, distribution inconsistent with known natural events. Another pause. The pattern suggests non-random occurrence. He stared at the words, then deleted the last line, replaced it with further analysis required. Kale closed the geological file, opened the genetic report. The summary line caught his attention immediately. Population bottleneck signature, irregular. He frowned, opened the full report. The data unfolded across the screen. Human genetic diversity showed evidence of multiple severe reductions in population. That was not unusual. Many species experienced bottlenecks. What was unusual was the pattern. 6 major events, each one reducing the population to a minimal subset, each one followed by full recovery. That alone was rare, but not impossible. What made Kale's attention sharpen was the consistency. The recovered populations did not show the expected genetic damage. No significant inbreeding markers. No degradation patterns. Instead, they appeared optimized, as if the reduction had not been random. Kale stopped again. He stared at the data longer this time, then opened a new note. Genetic bottlenecks, 6 major events. Below it, recovery patterns inconsistent with random survival. Another pause. Longer. Possible selection bias. He did not delete that line. Kale sat back slowly. The room felt quieter. He glanced at the 2 notes. Geological. Genetic. 6 layers. 6 bottlenecks. He did not connect them. Not yet. But something in his mind had already begun aligning them. Without permission. Without conclusion. Just proximity. He closed both files. Marked them for review. Then, after a moment, moved the geological note out of the low-priority category. For the first time since receiving the assignment, Kale hesitated before continuing. Kale did not intend to return to the data that quickly. He told himself that there were still reports to finalize, behavioral models to refine, procedural briefings to prepare. The study program was still in its early phase. There was no reason to deviate from structure. And yet, 3 hours later, he was back in his office, standing, looking at the geological scan. He had expanded the projection across the far wall. 6 horizontal lines cut through the depth chart. Each one clean. Each one distinct. Each one deliberate. He had adjusted the visualization scale, overlaying timelines, running interval measurements. The gaps between the layers appeared again. 450,000 years. 370,000 years. 290,000 years. 210,000 years. 120,000 years. They were not evenly spaced, but they were trending. The intervals were shrinking, gradually, systematically, as if whatever caused them was happening more frequently. Kale stared at the pattern, then turned back to his desk, opened the genetic report again. 6 bottlenecks. He isolated the timestamps, aligned them beside the geological events. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he activated the correlation overlay. The lines matched. Not approximately, not loosely, precisely, within the margin of geological dating error. HFY layer corresponded to a genetic collapse. Kale did not speak, did not react outwardly, but something in his posture changed. Subtly, the way it does when a mind crosses a threshold it cannot return from. He ran the correlation again, and again, each time refining the model, each time reducing the margin, each time tightening the alignment. The result did not change. It became sharper. 6 events. 6 collapses. Same timeline. He opened a new document. Then began typing. Working model. Planetary scale ash events, 6. Corresponding population bottlenecks, 6. Temporal alignment confirmed. He stopped. The next line took longer. Preliminary interpretation. The events are not independent. He leaned back. Read it. Then added. Observed characteristics suggest non-random causation. His fingers hovered for a moment. Then slowly, he typed, "Pattern indicates structured recurrence." He stared at that sentence. Longer than necessary. Then left it. Kale stood, walked to the wall, looked at the 6 lines again. It was too clean, too precise, too intentional. His mind began doing what trained minds do. Searching for alternatives. Natural explanations. Unknown geological processes. Unrecorded planetary instability cycles. But each possibility collapsed under the same problem. Uniformity. Natural disasters do not distribute evenly across a planet. They originate. They spread. They decay. These events did none of those things. They appeared everywhere at once. Kale turned back to his desk, opened the mythology file. He had not reviewed it in detail yet. It had been categorized as low analytical priority. Narrative systems rarely provided hard data. They were symbolic, fragmented, unreliable. So, he opened it. The report was structured differently. Comparative. 12 independent human cultures. Geographically isolated. Separated by oceans. By time. By language. No contact. No shared development. Kale began reading. Each culture had its own myths. Different gods. Different origins. Different structures. Exactly as expected. Then he reached the comparison matrix. One pattern repeated. Across all 12. He slowed. A civilization. Advanced. Powerful. Approaching a threshold. A decision. Not destruction. Not collapse. A choice. To stop. To burn what had been built. To begin again. Kale read the entries again. Carefully. Across all 12. The language differed. The symbols differed. The meaning did not. In 9 of them, there was an additional element. A message. They will return. When the world is ready. When the time comes. And in the oldest record, a phrase. Repeated. Not yet. Kale sat very still. 3 data sets. Geology. Genetics. Mythology. 6 events. 6 resets. 1 narrative. He opened a new document. Synthesis model. Geological events, 6. Genetic resets, 6. Mythological record, consistent across isolated cultures. He paused. Then wrote. All 3 data sets describe the same cyclical process. Another pause. Longer. He did not want to write the next line. But the structure demanded it. Process appears deliberate in nature. He stopped. Looked at the word. Deliberate. He deleted it. Replaced it with process appears structured. More acceptable. More neutral. Less dangerous. Kale stood again. Walked slowly across the room. The data remained on the wall behind him. 6 lines. Unmoving. He thought about the genetic recovery patterns. The absence of damage. The preservation of specific traits. Adaptive flexibility. Cooperation. Problem-solving capacity. Not random survivors. Selected ones. He stopped walking. And for the first time, allowed the thought to fully form. What if the species being reduced was also the one choosing who remained? He exhaled slowly. The room felt different now. Not quieter. Heavier. Kale turned back to the wall. Looked at the 6 lines again. They did not look like natural events. They looked like marks. Deliberate marks. Counting something. Waiting. He opened his communication interface. Drafted a message. Addressed to Ambassador Voss. He attached the correlation data. The geological layers. The genetic matches. The mythological overlap. Then he wrote, Ambassador Voss, I have encountered a series of inconsistencies within the preliminary data that I am unable to resolve through standard analysis. Your earlier recommendation appears to be connected to these findings. I would appreciate your perspective. He hesitated, then sent it. The reply came sooner than expected. 4 words. Yes. It aligns. Kale read it once. Then again. No explanation. No surprise. No correction. Just confirmation. He looked back at the 6 lines on the wall. For the first time, He understood something he hadn't before. She had known. From the beginning. Kale did not sleep that cycle. Not because he was afraid, but because the data would not let him rest. The 6 lines remained projected across his wall. He had turned off the room lights. Not intentionally. He simply had not noticed when they dimmed. The city outside his window had shifted into night, its layered architecture glowing in quiet gradients of light and shadow. None of it registered. His attention was fixed on the pattern. 6 events. Not random. Not natural. Not accidental. Structured. He had spent 3 centuries studying emerging civilizations. He knew the difference between chaos and design. Between coincidence and intention. This was not coincidence. He returned to the genetic file. This time, not reading it as a report, but as evidence. He isolated the trait clusters preserved across all 6 bottlenecks. The same 3 variables appeared repeatedly. Cognitive adaptability, cooperative stability, problem-solving capacity. Everything else fluctuated. These did not. He ran a projection. Simulated random survival conditions. The model collapsed. The probability of those same traits surviving 6 independent extinction events. Astronomically low. He adjusted the parameters. Introduced selection variables. The model stabilized. Kale stared at the result. Not survival. Selection. He said the word out loud this time. Quietly. Carefully. Selection. It did not sound theoretical anymore. He turned back to the geological data. Expanded the compositional analysis of the ash layers. Each one was made of known materials. Nothing alien. Nothing impossible. But the fusion patterns, the thermal signatures, the distribution, they did not match any natural process. He ran comparative models. Supervolcanic eruptions. Meteor impacts. Atmospheric ignition scenarios. All failed. Each one required a point of origin. A source. A direction. These events had none. They appeared everywhere at once. Kale leaned forward slowly. His hands resting on the edge of the desk. Planetary scale, simultaneous ignition. The words felt wrong. Not because they were incorrect, but because they implied something he was not yet ready to define. He stood abruptly. Moved to the far wall. Looked at the 6 lines again. Not lines. Events. 6 times. Something had burned the entire surface of a planet. And 6 times. The species had survived. Not barely. Not randomly. Correctly. Kale felt something unfamiliar press against the edge of his thinking. Not fear. Recognition. He turned away from the wall. Opened the mythology file again. He was not looking for patterns. He was looking for intent. The phrasing stood out differently now. No longer symbolic. No longer abstract. They chose to begin again. They set fire to what they had built. They made themselves small. Kale closed his eyes briefly. This was not myth. It was memory. Distorted. Fragmented. But consistent. Record. Of decision. He opened his working document again. Scrolled to the final line. Process appears structured. He deleted it. For a long moment he did not replace it. Slowly, he typed. Process appears intentionally executed by originating species. He stopped. Read it. The meaning settled into the room like weight. Not external. Internal. He exhaled slowly. If this is correct. He did not finish the sentence. Because the implication was already clear. Humanity had not survived 6 extinction events. Humanity had caused them. Kale stepped back. The room felt smaller now. Not physically, but conceptually. He looked again at the 6 lines. They were not marks. They were decisions. 6 decisions. Each one separated by hundreds of thousands of years. Each one. Repeated. He accessed the timeline again. Focused on the most recent event. Approximately 74,000 years ago. Toba. The last reset. He cross-referenced it with human developmental data. From that point forward, civilization began again. Slowly. Carefully. Controlled growth. Kale felt his mind trying to resist the conclusion. Trying to categorize it. contain it. But the structure would not allow it. 6 times, they had reached a point and stopped. Not because they failed, because they chose to. He turned back to the message, the one he had received earlier. Yes. It aligns. No explanation. No surprise. Confirmation. Kale spoke again. You knew. The words sounded different now. Not an accusation. A realization. He activated the communication channel again. Not formal. Direct. Ambassador Voss. The pause. Her image appeared. She was seated. Same posture. Same stillness. As if nothing had changed. Kale looked at her for a moment. The pattern is not natural. A statement, not a question. She inclined her head slightly. No, she said. Kale continued. The bottlenecks are not random. Another pause. No. He swallowed once. The events were executed. The word felt heavy. Final. She did not react. 6 times, Kale said quietly. Yes. Silence filled the space between them. Kale felt the last barrier in his thinking dissolve. Why? He asked. For the first time, there was a shift. Not in her expression, but in the space behind it. The pause. Measured. Then she said, that depends on how far you've gotten. Kale did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze slightly. Toward the wall behind him. Toward the 6 lines. Then back to her. Far enough, he said. Another pause. For the first time, she gave him something more than confirmation. Good, she said, and ended the connection. Kale stood in the silence that followed. The data behind him. The city beyond the glass. The weight of the realization settling fully into place. This was no longer a study. This was not a young civilization. This was not even a mystery. This was a species that had rewritten itself. 6 times. On purpose. And had now stopped. Kale looked once more at the 6 lines. And understood something else. The pattern had ended. Not because it was complete, but because something had changed. The excavation permit was approved in 8 days. 8 days was fast. It was fast because no one questioned it. A senior assessor requesting field access to study a newly contacted species was not unusual. It happened regularly. The request passed through the administrative layers without resistance, categorized exactly as it appeared. Routine. Standard. Unremarkable. Kale did not correct that assumption. He arrived on Earth 32 days later. The air was thinner than he expected. Carrying the scent of dust and stone and something older, something that had been exposed to sunlight for longer than most surfaces in the assembly's core worlds. The Anatolian plateau stretched out around him in quiet, uninterrupted distance. Low hills. Sparse vegetation. A horizon that did not demand attention. It looked ordinary. That, Kale thought, was becoming a pattern. The excavation site had already been marked. Coordinates aligned precisely with the deepest convergence point of all 6 geological layers. His team stood ready, 12 specialists. Experienced. Methodical. Unaware. He had not told them what he expected. He wanted the data clean. Unbiased. Uncontaminated by anticipation. They began digging. The first layers were exactly what they should have been. Recent human activity. Tools. Fragments of habitation. Signs of settlement stretching back several thousand years. Nothing unusual. They moved efficiently. Cataloging. Recording. Descending. On the 4th day, they reached the first ash layer. The geological specialist, Renverith, paused at the boundary. Ran her instruments across the surface. Then again. Slower. This isn't volcanic, she said. Kale did not respond. She adjusted the scan. Ran 3 additional analyses. Each one confirming the same result. The composition is familiar, she said carefully. But the fusion pattern, this required extreme temperature. Uniform exposure. She looked up at him. This didn't come from a source, she said. Kale met her gaze. I know. She held his eyes for a moment. Then looked back at the layer. And it happened everywhere, she added quietly. They continued. Below the ash, The soil changed. Subtly, but undeniably. Texture, density, structure. Ren noticed it first, then the others. This isn't natural deposition, one of the analysts said. Kale stepped closer. The shapes emerged slowly. Not immediately obvious, but one seemed impossible to ignore. Lines, angles, symmetry, architecture. Not primitive, not accidental. Designed. Kale felt his pulse shift. Not faster, more focused. How old? He asked. Ren didn't answer immediately. She recalibrated her instruments. Ran the dating sequence twice. Then a third time. Her voice was quieter when she spoke. Approximately 120,000 years. Silence followed. That was not possible. At that point in the accepted human timeline, there should have been nothing. Not this. Not structures. Not planning. Not design. And yet, there was. They expanded the excavation. The structure extended further than expected. Multiple sections. Organized layout. Intentional spacing. Kale walked through it slowly, carefully. He had studied architecture across dozens of species. He knew how intelligence expressed itself through structure, through proportion, through spatial reasoning. Was human, not modern, not identical, but the same underlying logic, the same patterns of thought. He stopped the thought. They continued digging. The second ash layer came, then the third. Each one identical, each one separating a different version of the same story. Below each, more structures. Simpler, but not less intelligent. Stripped, refined, as if each iteration had carried forward only what mattered. On the 9th day, they reached the deepest layer. The 6th, the ash here was denser, more complete, more final. Ren's instrument struggled briefly to calibrate at that depth. When they stabilized, her expression changed. This one burned hotter, she said. Kale nodded once. Go deeper. What they found below was different. Not just older. Different. The material was unfamiliar. Not alien. Not impossible. But not present in any known planetary database. The structures were intact. More preserved than anything above them. As if time itself had struggled to erode them. Kale moved through the space slowly. The design was deliberate. Not expansive. Not decorative. Focused. They found the chamber. Protected. Nested within multiple layers of that unknown material. It had not been damaged. Not by time. Not by pressure. Not by anything. It had been sealed. Waiting. They opened it carefully. The air inside was not stale. Just still. Kale stepped inside. The chamber was almost empty. Smooth surfaces. Minimal structure. And on the far wall, a pattern. Not carved. Not painted. Encoded. At a molecular level. His xenobiologist moved forward. Scanned it. Then scanned it again. Her voice, when she spoke, was precise. Controlled. This is biological. Kale turned toward her. What kind? She hesitated. DNA. Silence filled the chamber. Human DNA, she added. Kale felt the weight of that settle instantly. How precise? He asked. She brought up the comparison. Projected it into the air. 2 sequences. Side by side. Alignment percentage. 99.7%. This exact sequence, she said slowly, exists in the non-coding regions of every human genome currently living. Kale stared at the projection. Every human, every individual, carrying this. Without knowing. For how long? He asked. She looked at the dating again. Since this layer, she said. She didn't need to repeat the number. 2 million years. Kale turned back to the wall. The pattern no longer looked abstract. It looked intentional. Constructed. He spoke quietly. They encoded it into themselves. She nodded once. Yes. A message. Not stored in archives. Not written in language. Not carved in stone. But embedded into the biology of an entire species. Carried across extinction. Across time. across every reset. Impossible to lose. Impossible to erase. Kale stood in the center of the chamber and understood this had never been an accident. Not the resets. Not the survival. Not the waiting. This was a system. Designed. Maintained. Still active. He looked at the encoded sequence one more time. Decode it. It took 19 days to decode the sequence. 19 days of continuous analysis. Cross-referencing biological structures. Mapping symbolic encoding patterns. Eliminating false interpretations. Running the data again. And again. And again. Kale did not leave the site. He did not return to the assembly. He did not respond to incoming communications beyond what was strictly necessary. Everything narrowed to one point. The message. When the xenobiologist finally approached him, it was near dusk. The plateau stretched out in muted tones of gold and shadow. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying dust across the excavation lines. She didn't speak immediately. She handed him the translation. Kale took it, looked at it, and read. Then again. Slower. The message was not long. Not complex. Not technical. It did not contain data, or instructions, or history. It contained only this. Not yet. The others are not ready. Not yet. When you are no longer alone. Begin. Kale stood completely still. He had expected something larger. A record. A warning. A directive. Instead, a sentence. Simple. Absolute. He read it a third time. Not yet. The words settled differently now. Not a delay. A decision. Kale lowered the translation slowly. Around him, the excavation site continued in quiet motion. His team working. Cataloging. Processing. None of it felt connected anymore. Because everything had already changed. 6 resets. 6 times. A civilization had reached a point. And stopped. Not because it failed. Because it chose not to continue. Kale's mind began aligning the final pieces. The ash layers. The bottlenecks. The preserved traits. And now, the message. The others are not ready. Not a statement about humanity. A statement about the universe. He looked up. Across the horizon. For 2 million years, humanity had looked outward. And found nothing. No other intelligence. No other civilization. Alone. Completely. And each time, they had reached a threshold. A point where their growth, their knowledge, their power, became too much. Too unbalanced. Too dangerous. Not because they were weak. Because they were alone. Kale felt something shift deep in his understanding. The resets were not failures. They were safeguards. Species that had looked at itself. At what it could become. And decided. Not yet. He exhaled slowly. 6 times, he said quietly. The xenobiologist nodded. Yes. 6 times. They had burned everything. Not in panic. Not in collapse. In control. 6 times. They had reduced themselves. Preserved only what mattered. Rebuilt. Waited. For what? Kale looked down at the message again. When you are no longer alone, begin. The answer was already there. They had not been waiting for technology. They had not been waiting for progress. They had not been waiting for survival. They had been waiting for others. For someone else to exist. Kale felt the full weight of it settle. For 2 million years, humanity had chosen to remain small. Not because it couldn't grow. Because growing alone was dangerous. He thought about the assembly. 73 civilizations. Each one believing itself part of a vast, ancient system. Each one measuring age, progress, development, against each other. And all of them, had appeared after. Kale's grip tightened slightly on the translation. Humanity had not just survived. It had been watching, waiting, resetting itself, over and over, until the universe was finally populated. He looked back toward the chamber, at the encoded sequence, at the message that had been carried in every human body for millions of years. Not lost, not forgotten, waiting. Kale spoke again. They knew. The words felt insufficient. They always knew. The xenobiologist didn't respond. She didn't need to. Kale turned, looked out across the plateau, at the ordinary landscape, at a world that appeared young, primitive, and understood. It wasn't. Humanity was not a young species. It was not emerging. It was not developing. It was 2 million years of continuous intelligence. Hidden, reset, contained. Not because it lacked power, because it chose not to use it. Kale closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. The final piece settled into place. The pattern had stopped. No seventh reset. No seventh layer. Because something had changed. He looked up, and for the first time, allowed the conclusion fully. Humanity had found what it was waiting for. They were no longer alone, and that meant it was time to begin. Kale returned to the assembly 3 days later. The chamber was full. Not partially. Not formally. Completely. Every seat occupied. Additional tiers opened. Delegates standing where no one stood during standard sessions. Representatives arriving from distant systems without formal scheduling. No one had announced anything. No formal alert had been issued. But the data had moved. Quietly. And the assembly understood. Kale stood at the center of the chamber. The same position where new species were welcomed. The same place where humanity had stood 11 days earlier, when they were still considered. He activated the projection. The 6 lines appeared. No explanation. No introduction. Just the data. The room absorbed it in silence. The genetic overlay. The alignment. The pattern. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Because by now, the conclusion was inevitable. Kale moved to the final image. The message. He did not interpret it. He did not frame it. He simply read it. Not yet. The others are not ready. Not yet. When you are no longer alone, begin. The silence that followed was different. Not confusion. Not disbelief. Understanding. Slow. Heavy. Unavoidable. Chancellor Viral stood. For the first time since Kale had known him, he did not speak immediately. He looked across the chamber, at 73 civilizations, toward the outer ring, where Ambassador Voss sat, still, exactly as she had been on the first day. Assessor Kale, Viral said finally, his voice carrying less certainty than usual, your conclusion is that this species has maintained continuous intelligence for 2.3 million years. Kale said. No hesitation. No adjustment. The number settled into the chamber like weight. Viral continued. And that during this time, they have chosen to end their own development repeatedly. Yes. Another pause. And that this stopped. Kale looked toward Ambassador Voss. Then back to the Chancellor. Yes. The question came next. It had been forming in every mind in the room. Why? Kale did not answer immediately, because the answer was not his to give. Turned toward the outer ring. Toward her. Ambassador Voss stood. No announcement. No signal. She simply stood and began walking across the chamber. The same walk she had made before. But this time, the room felt different. Not because she had changed. Because they had. She reached the center. Stood beside Kale. Looked at the assembly. Not above them. Not below them. At them. For a moment, she said nothing. You've understood the pattern, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. You've identified the resets. A slight pause. And you've asked the correct question. She looked across the chamber. At all of them. We stopped, she said, because the condition changed. Silence held. For most of our history, she continued, we were alone. No one interrupted. No one moved. Every time we advanced far enough to reshape our world, to reach beyond it, to alter things we could not undo. She paused. We reached the same point. Kale felt the words before she said them. The dangerous point. She continued. A single species. With no external perspective. No opposition. No correction. Her gaze moved across the assembly. No one to say no. The implication settled instantly. That kind of isolation, she said, does not make a species powerful. A small pause. It makes it unstable. Kale felt something tighten in the room. Not fear. Recognition. We reached that point, she said, 6 times. And 6 times. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. We chose to stop. Not collapse. Not failure. We reduced ourselves, she said, preserved what mattered, and started again. Kale's mind replayed the data. The selected traits. Adaptability. Cooperation. Problem-solving. You were afraid, someone said quietly from the chamber. She turned her head slightly. Not offended. Not defensive. We were realistic, she said. Silence again. Because alone, she continued, we had no limits except the ones we imposed on ourselves. She looked back at the assembly. At 73 civilizations. Different. Independent. Now, she said, we don't. The shift in the room was immediate. Subtle. But absolute. Now there are others, she said. Not dramatic. Just true. Other perspectives. Other boundaries. Other species that will disagree, resist, intervene. She let that sit. That, she said quietly, is what makes it safe to continue. Kale felt the meaning land completely. Not power. Balance. Not dominance. Constraint. They had not been waiting to become stronger. They had been waiting for a universe where strength would not go unchecked. She looked once more across the chamber, then said the final line. That's what begin means. Silence. Total. Because now, they understood. Not yet. Had never meant delay. It had meant responsibility. No one spoke after that. The assembly, a structure that had governed 73 civilizations for centuries, had nothing to add. The silence was not uncertainty. It was recalibration. Slow. Irreversible. Chancellor Viral stood where he was. For the first time in his long tenure, he did not look like the center of the room. Like someone who had just realized. The center had been somewhere else all along. His gaze shifted. Not to Kale. To Ambassador Voss. There was no announcement. No formal declaration. No ceremony prepared for this. There had never been a need for one. And yet, the movement began. Subtle at first. A shift in posture. A change in orientation. Across the chamber, representatives adjusted. Not consciously, but inevitably. The outer ring, where new species sat, no longer made sense. Viral stepped forward. The sound of his movement echoed across the chamber. Not loud, but clear. He stopped in front of her, and for a moment, said nothing, because there were no existing words. For this situation. Quietly, Ambassador Voss. The pause. And something changed in his voice. Not authority. Respect. We misjudged your position. Not an apology. Something more fundamental than that. A correction. Voss looked at him. The same expression she had carried. Since the beginning. Not proud. Not satisfied. Certain. It happens, she said. No edge. No weight. Just truth. Behind them, the chamber remained still. Because everyone present understood. What had just shifted. Not power. Perspective. Humanity had never been behind. It had never been catching up. It had never been developing. Towards something greater. It had been waiting. Waiting. For the rest of the universe. To arrive. Kale stood where he was. And for the first time, he understood her expression. The one he had tried to name. Since the first day. It wasn't patience. It wasn't detachment. It wasn't superiority. It was recognition. The expression of someone who had already seen the end of the path and was simply waiting for everyone else to reach it. The assembly began to move again. Quiet conversations. Measured exchanges. Not panic. Not urgency. Adjustment. Because nothing had broken. But everything had changed. The city of Orinth Prime remained as it always had. Ancient structures. Endless layers of history. Civilizations built over time. And for the first time, They were no longer the oldest story in the room. At the center of the chamber, in the place where decisions were made, Ambassador Voss took her seat. Not in the outer ring. Not behind. At the center. Her hands folded calmly. Her gaze steady. And for the first time in 2 million years, humanity was no longer waiting. It was beginning.